here. I don't know where he is.
Well, good evening. I'd like to welcome you all to the James Baker Institute for Public Policy. We're very pleased to have you here this evening, and I think you're going to find that it's going to be a very interesting program. As we're meeting here tonight, the International Space Station is flying in orbit with a crew of 6. There are 3 Russian cosmonauts and 2 Americans and a Canadian. And come this July, it'll be 2 years since an American spacecraft has been up to visit that station. And this July also, it'll make 4 years that the Russians have been taking the Americans up to the International Space Station. They've been a good partner, and it looks like they're going to be doing that for some time to come. And for an American astronaut, the road to space is really through Star City and Baikonur in Kazakhstan, and then up to the International Space Station. And as I say, it will be that way for a long time to come. Human spaceflight really has become historically a measure of a country's leadership in space. And with the large gap that is occurring in flying humans in space, certainly that has affected the leadership, the perception of the United States as a leader in space. And it looks like that is going to occur for, as I say, that gap is going to continue for a good while. Last month, there were 2 reports that came out that addressed NASA and the future of NASA. One was done by the National Research Council, and one was done by the Space Foundation. The National Research Council pointed out, and I think rightly so, that NASA is at a transition point due to a set of circumstances that is really beyond their control to some degree. Their budget has been a level budget in constant year dollars, but their programs have been getting increasingly more expensive, and their infrastructure, the infrastructure that exists within the agency that they're having to service, has been there since it was established during the height of the Apollo program. And as you look to the future, the programs that they have to do are out of sync with the budget, and the budget pressures are going to continue. The National Research Council also commented that there was not a national consensus on what the NASA vision should be. And there wasn't a national consensus, and even a consensus within NASA, that their existing mission to send a human to an asteroid is really supported. So they had a number of recommendations. They had a number of options that they proposed to get the NASA budget back into some accord with the programs that it's going to have to do. And of course, the National Space Foundation took a little different twist. They addressed NASA and said that really NASA should be a pioneering organization, and they ought to divest themselves of all those activities and all those functions that don't support that pioneering aspect. They didn't identify those, but one can imagine what they might be. So it's against that backdrop that we're having this meeting this evening. And I think we have 6 panelists this evening that I think are eminently well qualified to speak to NASA and the future and where we might go and what kind of a space policy the country needs. So we're going to start off this evening with John Logsdon. John Logsdon is a professor emeritus in political science and international affairs from George Washington's Elliott School of International Affairs. He taught there for 38 years. And he also is a founding and long-term director of George Washington University's Space Policy Institute. He has a great biography, I think, included in your program, so I'm not going to go all through that. So let me turn it over to John.
Thank you, George. One of the things that didn't happen before this evening is any sense of the order of speakers. So it was only when I got here that I discovered I was first. my mental set was I was going to react to what everybody else said, which is hard to do in the lead-off position. My identity in the space policy field is kind of, I'm old and have been looking at this stuff for a long time. Mr. Abbey said, when he said, why don't you start, let's put some historical context into the current debate. So that's what I will try to do. George did a good job of summarizing the recent National Research Council report. It's a report worth reading. It's called NASA's Strategic Direction. It was a group of people half familiar with the space program, half not, that were asked to assess NASA's strategic direction, looked at it and said, doesn't have one. It is, they didn't say we're lost in space, as the title of tonight's program suggested, but they certainly intimated that we didn't have a very clear image of where we're going. How have we gotten, 55, today is the 24th, so 1 week from today is the 55th anniversary of the first U.S. satellite, Explorer 1. 55 years into U.S. space activity, and we're still saying, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? That's an interesting phenomenon, and it's, I want to reflect a little bit on why that is the case and whether we're at a point where something can be done to give a more clear orientation towards the future. The word in the title of tonight, definitive, I'm not quite sure what that means, what a definitive space policy is. Maybe we can come back to that in discussion. It sounds a little more precise than I would think in a political system would ever be possible, but so it goes. So I think you can more or less divide the history of the U.S. space program into a set of eras, the first of which was clearly Apollo. I mean, there were 3 years of just getting started while President Eisenhower was in office, but it was when Kennedy came into office in 1961, there was no clear future for NASA. There were considerations of ending human spaceflight. A lot of people didn't want the NASA job because they didn't want to preside over a declining agency. That's hard to imagine, given what happened. But that was the situation in January of 1961. It was the stimulus of the Gagarin flight that led Kennedy to say to his advisors, find me a space program which promises dramatic results in which we could win. Pretty clear strategic direction. Space, dramatic results, win. And the answer came back that sending people to the surface of the moon was the first accomplishment that NASA had more than a 50-50 chance of doing before the Soviet Union. So Kennedy said, sure, let's do it, and did it. He not only made the decision to go to the moon, he provided the resources to implement that decision in his remaining 30 years in office. So there was a strategic direction. There was a clear goal of using the space program as an instrument of U.S. foreign policy to demonstrate U.S. technological and managerial power in a peaceful way to the rest of the world and to reestablish a sense of national pride and common accomplishment. I unfortunately think that however positive those elements were, in the overall assessment, doing Apollo so soon was not good for the space program. It used up the obvious destination, the moon, right away. Because it was defined as a race, it was not sustainable. There was no reason to keep racing once you won the race. It created an image of what NASA was about large-scale engineering achievement built around human spaceflight with a large infrastructure to support the effort. I think in a sense we've spent the past 40 or so years, if I wish to say it, I'm not sure I do in this crowd, trying to escape the heritage of Apollo and figure a new direction that's more sustainable, more productive for the future. As Richard Nixon came into office, and I should say I'm trying to work on a new book on Richard Nixon and the U.S. space program, and so I've been spending a lot of time in the Nixon archives and Nixon library, which is kind of interesting. Side footnote, the Nixon fans have chosen to mark the 100th anniversary of Nixon's birth, which was just a few weeks ago, with an exhibit at the National Archives in Washington on Nixon and the space program. I bet in this crowd, none of you would have identified that and Nixon as something worth celebrating, but there it is. And in fact, I think he made arguably a correct decision that the country was not interested in maintaining the kind of high-profile, fast-paced, expensive program aimed at continuing exploration that was proposed to him at the height of the success of Apollo, with the extreme version having the first mission to Mars take off in 1981. There was a report under a group chaired by Vice President Spiro Agnew that made that set of recommendations that Mars should be the defining, shaping goal of U.S. space effort. Nothing's changed since then. But that there should be an integrated, fast-paced, definitive program aimed eventually at human missions to Mars. Mr. Nixon said, no, space has to be lowered to be part of the normal part of politics. And I guess I'll say now rather than conclusion, if something becomes the normal part of how we make decisions in this country, then the idea of definitive strategy and policy is a non sequitur. That's not the way we make decisions in this country on anything. So if space is not exceptional but part of the normal flow of political decisions, the idea of a definitive policy is probably a non-starter. The Nixon administration was then faced with the issue, if not an ambitious Apollo-like continuation, then what? And the answer turned out to be the space shuttle. I found the kind of smoking gun record of a meeting. John Ehrlichman kept minutes of all of Nixon's meetings. So I found this memo of a meeting, November the 24th, 1971, said the president has decided to support the space shuttle as long as it's located in California. He was very concerned about aerospace unemployment in California before the 1972 elections. That's normal politics. That's the way decisions are made. There was no strategic framework. In fact, one of the option papers for the shuttle decision said the beauty of the shuttle is we can choose a program without choosing either a goal or a destination. And that decision defined the program because a decision to eventually build a space station was kind of connected at the hip with the decision to build the shuttle. That decision defined the program for the next 40 years until Chris Ferguson landed STS-135 in July of 2011. There was a recognition along the way that really wasn't a strategy. There were various attempts to change that. There was a National Commission on Space in 1986, the Space Exploration Initiative under Dr. Albrecht's gentle guidance in 1989. I suspect Mark will talk about that. The vision for space exploration in 2004. Obviously, none of them took. Which brings us up to the current time where the people that came in 2009, General Bolden, Miss Garver, spirit of honesty. Lori Garver is one of my former students. I sometimes take credit for that, not always. Sorry, Lori. Wanted to change the paradigm to something that was strategic, that had a future vision, a particular way of doing things that once it was announced, many disagreed with. There were so many vested interests in the way that things had been done rather than the way that they were proposed to be done, that the result has been, I think, an uneasy and unsatisfactory compromise, which is the situation we're in today. So is there a chance of changing that? That's the question that the five gentlemen to my right, four gentlemen and one gentle lady to my right, will address. And I'll come back probably and comment on it in the Q&A. I'm not very optimistic, at least in the short run. The perception of the need is there, but it's not a widely shared perception. And it's hard to change things in our system of government. It's designed to be hard to change things, but it's worse. I've been in Washington now 46 years, and it's worse now than I've ever seen it. So the idea that out of the current criticism and controversy, there can arise a consensus on the need for change and the need for a definitive space policy. As I say, I'm not very optimistic. Gene says he's going to be positive, so.
In the manner of speaking.
Well, thank you, John. John is also the author of a fairly recent book, John F. Kennedy and the Race to the Moon, and I would certainly recommend that book to you. It's very, very interesting and gets back into a lot of the history that he was speaking about.
Yeah, George, the new book is Retreat from the Moon, Richard Nixon and the American Space Program. Look for it in 2014.
Our next speaker is Gene Levy. Gene is the Andrew Hayes Buchanan Professor for Astrophysics in the Astronomy and Physics Department here at Rice University. He was a provost here at Rice for 10 years. And prior to that time, he was a professor for planetary science and physics in the University of Arizona. He became head of the department there at Arizona and also served as the director of the Lunar Planetary Science Laboratory there for 10 years. He has served on a number of NASA advisory committees in science and is serving on the science committee of the NASA Advisory Council today. Let me turn it over to Gene.
Thanks, George. So the premise of this colloquy this afternoon is expressed in the title. That is that the United States is lost in space. What that apparently means is that the United States has failed to articulate, has failed to plan, has failed to fund, and has failed to undertake an ambitious continuation of human-piloted missions that began with the Apollo Man on the Moon series of expeditions and ran for 3.5 years, from the first Apollo landing in 1969 to the last one in 1972. We just passed, last month, the 40-year mark since the last time a terrestrial human being set foot on any natural extraterrestrial object. This 4-decade hiatus has given rise to a great deal of soul-searching, naval exploration, I mean naval with an E, not naval with an A, naval exploration, and criticism of public and political processes in the United States. Notwithstanding that hiatus, there has been an articulate school, let me say it again, there has been a vocal school of thought advocating continuing expansion of the sphere of human physical presence in space, building on the achievements of Apollo and taking us by now, well, to you choose the destination. A host of destinations has been put forward. at various times. The list of places and the purported purposes of the trips continues to evolve and has never become stable. The failure to implement continuity in the deep space human exploration program, despite that failure, we should not lose sight of the positive aspects of the discussion over the past 4 decades. The lack of continuity in pursuing deep space piloted missions has, in my view, enjoyed a parallelism in thought and in outcome between the two political parties that could well represent the single greatest area of political cohesion that our nation has witnessed over the past 4 decades. While on the political stages, the players shoot in every which direction, in actuality, the cohesion has been truly remarkable. Even recently, the current president is blamed by many for the loss of national human access to space, but of course that outcome was pre-programmed by his predecessor in the other party. I want to emphasize I'm not making any political comments here. In fact, I'm not even necessarily being critical. I'm just describing the reality. Similarly, the current president is criticized by many for not planning the next stage of deep space piloted goals and missions, such as a moon colony. But during the campaign, his opponent of the other party insisted that if anyone in his administration were to advocate putting a colony on the moon, that individual would be fired immediately, apparently oblivious to the fact that Mike Griffin was at that moment a prominent member of his Space Policy Advisory Board, for what that's worth. The lost in space characterization of the NASA program is, I guess, meant to capture a sense of crisis, as if we are otherwise wanting for crises on the US political landscape. But I'd like to set a different context, and I want to speak very briefly because we'll have a conversation. I'd like to set a context for my view here by taking a different perspective. I'd like to suggest that the failure to articulate and mount a program of human piloted missions to deep space, rather than being a crisis, rather than being a bungle of leadership and political process, represents a triumph of rationality and a success in the political process. Of course, by no means can the stasis or the paralysis that has characterized the discussion and development of our national future in piloted missions to deep space, in no way can that itself be considered a triumph of leadership. However, it might be considered a triumph of rationality and a triumph of good judgment, or a holding back of attempted leadership towards a future that would be of at best questionable and certainly of undemonstrated real value. I'd like to suggest that no convincing case has been made for mounting a program of deep space piloted missions. It's not for lack of trying. It is just that a convincing case has not been made, despite reams of reports and opinions that have been published over a 4-decade period of time. I'm mindful of the downside and the hazard of seeming to oppose human piloted missions in deep space, especially living in Houston, but not just in Houston, anywhere among the believers. In fact, I'm not opposed per se to deep space piloted missions. In a vacuum, I think they're fine. I can almost hear you all saying, of course, in a vacuum, where else would you do space missions? But I didn't mean in a physical vacuum. I meant in a conceptual vacuum. Leaving all other issues aside, including money, competing programs, and other priorities, etc., every kind of exploration is a good thing. I mean, who could oppose deep space piloted exploration going everywhere? After all, it's not hazardous to your health. It may be hazardous to the health of the astronauts. It's not hazardous to the health of the people who pay for it. Every kind of exploration is in principle a good thing. But we actually don't have the luxury of leaving everything else aside. It seems likely that NASA is already getting about as much of the national resource as it is likely to get on any time horizon worth planning for. I certainly do not expect the NASA budget or any other budgets of somewhat connected agencies to expand substantially in the foreseeable future. And one element of essential unanimity in the plethora of hand-wringing reports about our nation's stalled future in manned space is the assertion, the clear asserted opinion, which I think is justifiable and defensible and almost inescapable, that the budgets are insufficient for the aspirations that have been articulated, even if they've not been adopted as national goals. Continuing to plan and continuing to expand toward eventualities that will not come to pass is not a recipe for a rational program, and it's not a recipe for success in any endeavor. Let me conclude these brief remarks by saying I do not believe that the absence of an expanding human presence in space is the reason that the NASA program or the space program writ large of the United States seems lost. I think it's because we continue to try to recapture the singular excitement of the 1960s during a different time when we were confronting different conditions, and to again capture the excitement of doing for the first time that which you can only do for the first time once. My own view is that the real loss in space is threefold. The first is our failure to capitalize fully on the burgeoning capacities of robotics, automation, remote manipulation, and artificial intelligence to assert our presence in space in a manner that is fitting to the 21st century and at a level that is fitting to the world's leading social and technological powerhouse. Second, that our continuing and failing attempts to plan for alternatives that are neither realistic nor would be especially rewarding were they to come to pass is a valuable and fruitful activity. And in particular, I mean the continued planning for deep space human piloted missions and colonization. Our inability to accommodate our own launch capability to near Earth space is, in my view, is another serious problem. Despite my skepticism about the value and reward that awaits us from piloted missions to deep space, I think a good case can be made for the development of an expanding operational capability in near Earth space with human beings. The inability to launch our own people is a problem. However, it's not clear to me that there's any deficit if that capability is developed by the private sector. In fact, I think that would be a step forward. I think I'll conclude my remarks there and hope for some discussion later.
Thank you, Gene. Our next speaker is Neal Lane. Neal is a senior fellow here at the Baker Institute for Science and Technology. He served as the Science and Technology Advisor to the President Clinton, and headed up the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House at that time, from 1998 to 2001. Prior to that time, he was head of the National Science Foundation and a member of the National Science Board. There's a lot of other accolades within his bio, but I won't cover all those, but turn it over to you, Neal.
Thank you very much, George. It's certainly an honor to join this panel. In fact, I'm a little overwhelmed. Everybody else at the table knows a lot about space. I thought what I would do is reflect just a little bit on what connection I've had with space policy, and say a little bit maybe about policy making in this country and what I think some of the problems were. 1998 to 2001, when I was in the White House, was really a very interesting time for space. Space Station was being put together. Had the opportunity to meet interesting people. I mean, the Apollo 11 crew came in. I had a chance to host them for their visit with the President to celebrate the 30th anniversary. John Glenn came in prior to his launch and on the shuttle, and we had a chance to help work with NASA to help get all the White House people, essentially everybody, bailed out of Washington to go down and see the launch, so it was a lot of fun. I had lunch with John Glenn at Johnson Space Center. He treated me to an astronaut lunch and told me all about the secrets of shrimp cocktail and so forth. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience. So there were a lot of fun things. I suited up in the orange suit with Dan Golden with the diaper. I missed a great photo op actually there, but it's too late to recover that. Even landed the shuttle simulator almost successfully. I wasn't asked to do that again. It was an exciting time, and as I said before, the space station was being put together. So, including the first control module all the way to delivery of the first resident crew, which happened before I left the White House. I have to say I was in awe of the space station. I still am. especially building it in orbit as the kind of international partnership that it really is. I really don't believe the American people have any idea what an incredible technological and diplomatic achievement it really was and is. And I think that's a problem for us. All was not rosy. I mean, that's when we had problems with the climate orbiter and the polar lander. However, many of the other robotic Mars missions were and have been just quite extraordinary. And Congress, controlled by Republicans in those years, this is a political statement, incidentally, but okay, in a fit of paranoia about China, slapped the space technology with the ITAR regulations, which is a huge policy mistake in my view, which I think has cost us dearly. Finally, the Obama administration, working with the Congress, has moved to correct that situation. We'll see how that goes. Since returning to Rice, I've had the great good fortune to work with George Abbey, and he's been my mentor on space issues, helped me get ready for testimony, get ready for hearings, and we've published a couple of papers together, and I'm very grateful to George for that collaboration. I want to share with you a few of my impressions about Washington and the White House that I hope are relevant here. I'm going to try to keep my language clean here. Anyone who works for any length of time in that town, and there's expertise at the table here, comes away with a lot of lessons learned, and sometimes you learn them the hard way. We've all got scars and bruises. Most of my experience in Washington was positive, including experience about the space program. President Clinton was excited about science, technology, the space issues. Vice President Gore, even more excited, I would say. Many in Congress, on both sides of the aisles, were interested in space matters. They were fascinated by new discoveries, and they were proud of the achievements of the country and NASA in particular. The President liked to hear about scientific discoveries in our reports, and the White House staff did as well. Of course, OMB and the appropriations staff have a different job. So there's a lot of whining about the cost of everything, the cost of cost of shuttle operations, the overruns and the cost of the space station. A lot of grousing in Congress about the Russians' key role, which President Clinton was responsible for. And I heard the usual complaints about the NASA culture, about lobbying by NASA centers and so forth. Now, I also heard many complaints from the community. Why doesn't the president take a stronger positive position with regard to the space program? Why is this not higher priority on his agenda? Well, I think you could argue, and we have experts at the table, that no president, except Kennedy, has really placed the space program high enough on the list of priorities to be sustainable. And Kennedy, of course, was driven by the Cold War interests in the space race with the Soviet Union and the Gagarin flight, as John has already said, not by extraordinary public pressure to put men on the moon. Presidential priorities, as we all know, are often dictated by happenings in the rest of the world, things like national security, energy, oil, gas wars, economic recessions, and so forth. And what you quickly learn in the White House is the president doesn't get to do most of what he wants to do. There are always pressures on the budget, and they're usually against what the president is trying to do. The political opposition will try to derail anything the president wants to do, and I would say we're off scale in the current situation. Crises happen. You don't know what they'll be or when they'll occur, but they sometimes have to be topped on the president's agenda, on the nation's agenda, and every policy consideration has a political, even a partisan side to it, including space policy, so there's a lot of give and take. I still hold out the hope that someday our space program will excite the public to the degree that presidents and members of Congress will place it higher on the list of priorities. But it's not happened yet, and it can't happen, in my view, very quickly. That's one reason discussions like this one today, I think, are important, and I hope will go on all across the country. Now, the Space Foundation issued a report recently called Pioneering, it's shorthand, that's been referred to in writings and conversations. It addressed 4 myths. So I'll use those 4 myths because I heard them all the time, just to make a comment. So first myth, an ambitious space program is too expensive. Well, yes and no. I mean, at the peak of Apollo, the NASA budget was over 4% of discretionary federal spending. Today it's under 0.5%. On the other hand, in terms of constant dollars, it was only maybe a factor of 2 or between 2 and 3 below what it is right now. So if you double the NASA budget, you really could make an extraordinary investment in space science and exploration and all the other responsibilities NASA has. Is that out of the question? Well, NIH got a budget doubling between 1999 and 2003. So there is precedent. And of course, NIH has not done so well since the doubling. So when there tend to be these bumps, they tend to come down again, and that's hard to manage, and it usually creates all kinds of crises. So you have to be careful what we wish for on the doubling front. Myth number 2, space activities do not have enough support from the public. Well, I would say again, yes and no. Space polls quite well with the general public, depending on which question you ask. But like a lot of things, poll numbers don't automatically translate into budgets because they don't automatically translate into who gets elected and who doesn't, and for other reasons. Myth 3, presidential leadership is needed to drive space activities. Well, yes and no. When it comes to budgets, Congress takes the lead from the president, even if the opposing party says that budget is dead on arrival. Past presidents have put forward bold visions for space program, but the funding really did not arrive. Myth 4, greater congressional support can drive space activities. Well, this is another be careful what you wish for. It's true, without substantial bipartisan support in both House and Senate, major budget initiatives are not likely to happen. But Congress is really not the right place to develop strategic plans. Planning needs to come from NASA and the space community and have the president's strong support. In the past, planning has usually not worked very well. I think we need a new approach to planning that includes a much wider community of stakeholders than has been the tradition. That's kind of one of my bottom lines this evening. I'll close with 2 cents about the future of the space program, or maybe it's 1 cent given my level of expertise in this area. I want to make 3 quick points. First, the goals of the 1958 National Aeronautics and Space Act are, I believe, still valid, even though the political climate has changed. I believe NASA should continue to have a balanced program focused on science, aeronautics, space technology, human space travel, assuming we are going to have humans in space, cooperation with other agencies, and international cooperation. Trying to offload any of these to some other part of government, I think, would be a big mistake for the country and for the agency. Second point, as the recent NRC report, several reports actually make clear, the current plans for NASA really are inconsistent with the budgets, and that's already been spoken to. The 2012 NRC report offers several options, none of which I find particularly attractive, except the one about the growing of the budget. The report also recommends the administration really needs to take the lead in forging a new consensus, a new national consensus on NASA's future that is stated in terms clearly of clear defined strategies, goals, strategic goals, and objectives. Well, if only this were possible. I mean, in today's political climate, as John's already commented, forming a consensus on almost anything is extremely difficult. One still has to try. One thing does seem clear to me. Any effort to form a consensus must include an unprecedented outreach to inform and involve the American public. The American public is not well informed, and they're not involved and certainly don't feel involved. Finally, the third of my list of 3, given the space capabilities of other countries and regions, it makes little sense for the U.S. to try to go it alone in human spaceflight or space-based science. We went through a period where that clearly was the posture of the United States. Our traditional partners are key to future peaceful cooperation in space, science, and exploration. We've had a very good working relationship with our space station partners, but we need to expand that partnership to include such countries as China, India, Brazil, and perhaps other countries. China, for example, even though it's spending an enormous amount of money, in my view, is still fairly early on its development curve. It's going to continue to make investments, substantial investments, in infrastructure and in science and technology and other things the country needs. Space likely to be a very big part of that. If we ignore China's growing space capabilities, somehow fail to take advantage of the opportunity provided by that, I think we make a big strategic mistake. Sadly, we have partisan politics in the way, and ITAR is still a barrier to China. So I'll close with the obvious point. Our present Cold War system of policymaking on pretty much all science and technology matters, but I'll limit it to that, including space, is simply not working very well. It was designed a long time ago. A lot has changed in our country. A lot has changed in the world. It doesn't work very well. I think it's time to start a serious adult conversation and get some new ideas on the table, not just new policies. We got lots of reports with lots of good policy recommendations. I'm talking about the system that we use to set policy. Now, does Neal want to reorganize government? Well, sure, that's great. I mean, reorganizing government is just a lot of fun, and we've all engaged in such discussions. But I'm not going to live long enough to reorganize government. The other problem with the reorganizing government, it really takes a crisis to get that done, and the outcome is often not as good as what you had to start out with. So it's a very risky venture. No, I think what we really need to do is to find a way to form a closer, a better working relationship between the federal government and the private sector, not just the space-interested private sector, but more broadly, and in the case of science, the universities around the country, to have a serious long-term look at policies, including space policies and many others, if we're going to make any progress. I've been giving some thought to such ideas. They're a little bit crazy. People are going to have better ideas than the ones I've got. If you have good ideas along those lines, please get in touch, because I would love to hear them. Because I think the way we're going right now hasn't been working well for a very long time. We need a new direction, and I think we need a new approach. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Neal. Our next speaker is Joan Johnson-Freese, who's a professor of national security affairs at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. She's also on the faculty of the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in the Air War College, and was also director for the University of Central Florida of their Space Policy Center for Space Policy and Law. I'll turn it over to you, Joan.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this evening on this esteemed panel and being asked to think about this topic. It gave me the opportunity to rewrite these two cards 6 or 7 times to think of a way how I wouldn't be Debbie Downer. And was not very successful, and I probably won't use them anyway, because being fourth, a lot of what was on here has been said, so I'll try and not repeat myself too much. I also should mention, as Mr. Abbey said, I'm with the Naval War College, but I'm speaking tonight, since I tend to be a little opinionated sometimes, I need to point out, speaking for myself as an academic, and certainly not for the Defense Department, the Department of the Navy, or the U.S. government. Like John, I was a little stuck on the word definitive, the need for a definitive space policy. Do we need a definitive space policy? Yes. What does that mean? Well, I'm not sure, because, of course, there are multiple space communities. There's NASA, there's the military, there's Intel, there's commercial, and at one point in 2009, I was on the National Academy of Sciences Space Studies Board committee that looked at this comprehensive space policy, and they did a report called America's Future in Space, aligning the civil program with the national needs, which I think points out part of the problem of looking at NASA and looking at the civil space program alone really runs into problems like ITAR and China and issues that go beyond the civil space program. But at the heart of all this, I think the problem is politics. Politics is the art of the possible. I'm a political scientist, so I can say this. And from my perspective, as an instructor at the Naval War College, our students in my department, we study 3 things: strategy, specifically strategic mismatches, organizational behavior, and leadership. And we use NASA as case studies on all 3. I would agree that there have been repeated strategic mismatches as characterized by goals which are not supported by resources or rational timetables. I think the previous administration, the plans to go to the moon was a great vision, but only poets plan strategy without a budget. And I think that's exactly what it was. And I think the Obama administration, quite frankly, was right to pull the plug on the life support system that was not adequately funded to meet the goal. I also believe it's time for this transition, and transitions are always very difficult. And I've been a supporter of, yes, it's time to transition low Earth orbit to the private sector and let NASA concentrate on other destinations, but I don't think the Obama administration really wanted to set a destination. I think they were trying to get rid of legacy systems, get rid of the whole idea of destinations and build new technology. But public outcry of we need a goal, suddenly an asteroid appeared. And I was a supporter of that as well. But it's been 3 years now. And I would suggest if that is in fact a goal that is they are serious about, there ought to be first steps taken. There ought to be some telescopes being built to identify, I don't know, which particular asteroid or asteroids. You would need multiple destinations. And this doesn't seem to be done. And if I'm wrong, I hope you'll all tell me. But other than pockets of people doing view graphs and PowerPoints, I'm not sure that there's actually much being done or as much as could have been done in 3 years. So there's this strategic mismatch. I would also argue, as others have, Washington is littered with policies and studies. We don't need any more studies. We've got more policies than we know what to do with. But organizational behavior being what it is, I think if you were to ask, with this recent National Research Council study that was done that said there is no consensus, apparently when it was briefed to the White House, they listened very politely and said, we're going to an asteroid. Okay. Ask Congress. Well, you'll get a different answer in the House than the Senate. So everybody in their own little stovepipe has a different opinion of what the consensus is, and that is not a consensus. Part of organizational behavior, too, is to move things forward, you need a crisis. Well, what can be the crisis? China's the crisis. China's doing all kinds of things in space. It has an ambitious and aggressive space program. Yes, it does. What China has that we don't is political will. They don't have super technology. It's actually quite Spartan. I'm over there quite a bit, and they are moving forward, and they will continue to move forward. But it is very difficult in a democracy to garner the kind of political will that is needed to push manned spaceflight, human spaceflight forward. Polls will show there is support for space exploration. As was already said, it's the question that matters. If the follow-up question to the same group of 100 people is, and which would you prioritize for government spending? Education, health, job training, defense, or space exploration? It drops right to the bottom. It does come in ahead of foreign aid. But it doesn't come in ahead of any of those things that, in fact, are short-term needs. And I would suggest as well, outside of pockets like Houston and around Kennedy Space Center and parts of California, it is not a voter priority. The American people, for the most part, get what they want. If they really wanted an aggressive, ambitious space program, they would be clamoring on the doors of their politicians to get it together and do something. But that's not the case. And I don't think it's a matter of education. I think it's a matter of, again, rational policymaking. That what they want when you're hanging on the edge of the fiscal cliff doesn't necessarily translate into more money for space exploration. There have been attempts to gin up a crisis with, again, China. When I'm in China, I was in China last year giving a series of lectures at their law schools. And just as a little side note, we have 200 accredited law schools, and they have over 2,000. That's a good news for us. That's good news for us. I wrote an editorial on that. That was good news. And I would try and talk to them about the need to be responsible space partners, and I had the speech you might expect all worked up. And when it came time to Q&A, the first question inevitably was, could you please explain the American political system to us and how it is that the president can say he wants more space cooperation, potentially including China, but yet NASA is banned from talking to China, even talking to China about bilateral cooperation? Well, Here we are, and we don't understand it. So imagine it's very difficult for them as well. So is there a crisis? We're not racing China. China and India, I would argue, might be in a race, but not us. But the important part of that, as Mr. Abbey said, is the perception of leadership. Leadership, space, the connotation of leadership or of space is regarding the future. And the leaders go into the future. And if we are seen as ceding that leadership to other countries, it will have larger geostrategic implications, which is where I think we have the biggest opportunity to really push forward with the need for a consensus. And I think that consensus is going to have to go beyond NASA. It's going to have to go outside of regular kind of chains of operation and modes of operation to include all the space communities and make it part of, again, a geostrategic leadership effort. We're not going to sell it based on excitement alone. There will have to be a need. And frankly, I don't think it's going to happen in the near future. Again, with economics and the fiscal cliff looming in the future, one of the options for policymaking is called muddling through. And that's where we are. And I think that's where we're going to stay. And I'm usually pretty down on Congress because of the partisan, the nature of partisan politics there, where I think partisanship will trump rationality any day of the week. But in this case, I think the onus falls to the White House. If, in fact, an asteroid in some way, shape, or form is the goal for NASA, then I think it is up to the White House to budget for it and push it forward. Congress is not the place where policymaking should be done. And if this is what the White House wants, I think it is up to them to do it. I'm not terribly optimistic in that regard, however, because I think, again, other priorities are looming. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Joan. Joan has written, I might add, 2 excellent books that I would recommend for your reading: Heavily Ambitions, America's Quest to Dominate Space, and Space as a Strategic Asset. And both of them are very well done. Next speaker is Leroy Chiao. Leroy is known to many of you. He's an astronaut that has flown on the space shuttle 3 times. He's flown on the Soyuz spacecraft, both launched and landed on the Soyuz. And on that flight, he went up to the International Space Station and stayed there over 6 months and served as commander of the space station. He's left NASA and very much involved in the space program, even though he's not with NASA today. And in 2009, he served on the White House appointed committee to review the Human Spaceflight Plans Committee, which was chaired by Norm Augustine. So let me turn it over to you, Leroy.
Great, thank you, George. Well, it's a pleasure for me to be here and also an honor to be included in this panel. Well, how did we get here? As George just mentioned, in 2009, I was a member of the Review of U.S. Human Spaceflight Plans Committee, which became known as the Augustine Committee after Norm Augustine, our chairman. And we were charged with the then new administration to come up with option paths to form the basis of a new space policy. When we issued our report, if you take a look at our report, the very first sentences very clearly say something along the lines that the U.S. human spaceflight program is on an unsustainable trajectory, and that's because the programs had been inadequately funded, and we were biting off more than we could chew and getting farther and farther behind. So when we went to brief the White House on this and the new administration, it was made very clear. If you read our report, it says, new administration, you need to add $3 billion a year to the NASA budget if you want to do beyond low Earth orbit exploration. If you don't, that's fine. Keep the budget flat and simply continue to robustly support space station and continue to fly space shuttle. And the message was also very clear to the administration, please don't do the in-between where you want to do everything, but you only fund part of it. And unfortunately, that's what happened. $1.5 billion was added to the NASA budget, and they wanted to do everything, so here we are. I, too, am worried about leadership. That is my biggest concern, is how does the United States maintain the leadership position in human spaceflight? Since we retired the shuttle about a year and a half ago, you can certainly make a case that we have at least symbolically ceded the leadership position in human spaceflight because we can't launch our own astronauts into low Earth orbit. It's true, we are continuing to build the Orion spacecraft. You can think what you want about that, but the fact is that the first planned crewed mission of Orion is not till 2021, and that's dependent on the development and flight test and certification of the Space Launch System booster. So historically, I'm not sure I would be betting on 2021. Now, one of the most exciting and controversial parts of the new space policy was the stimulation of some commercial companies to get them going to see if they might be able to take over the taxi service between the surface of the Earth into low Earth orbit. And of course, we've seen some very great strides in that, some impressive strides, in fact, and 3 companies now are receiving NASA assistance in developing those capabilities. I'm getting more confident that 1 or more of those efforts will be successful. However, initial operational capability of any of those folks is at least several years away, and so that still continues to leave this gap. Today, only 2 entities are able to launch astronauts into space, Russia, of course, and the United States. International Space Station is one bright spot in our space program. It's continued to be operated robustly, but we can only get there flying with the Russians, as I did back several years ago. Now, one of the key findings that our committee came up with on International Space Station is that one of the big successes was this international framework that we were actually able to cooperate with all these different nations and create this absolute engineering marvel, something that was so audacious that even those of us in the astronaut office and the business were surprised how smoothly the construction sequence went. We were sure there would be at least 1 or 2 pretty major glitches that we'd have to do some major workarounds and get through, and certainly there were some glitches, but nothing of the magnitude that we feared back in the early days. International cooperation, I think, is the key to maintaining U.S. leadership in the future. We are the lead nation in the International Space Station, even though we can't send our own astronauts up there right now. But this international framework should be expanded. I agree that it should be expanded to include countries like China, and we can have a debate on the merits of that, but the bottom line is they will be a very different partner than Russia. Russia has been a superb partner. They supported us after the Columbia accident and enabled us to continue flying to ISS, such as my crew. We supported Russia in the days when they were about to lose Station Mir. Without the shuttle, they would have lost it many years earlier, and the capabilities of the shuttle allowed them to keep it. China will be a very different partner because it does have technology. Now, I'm going to disagree a little bit with you, Joan, because I've been over there several times, and I think their technology is pretty good. What they lack is operational experience. They've only flown, a handful of missions, and there's some very basic things that they haven't figured out yet. But they'll be a fine partner because they can help pay for everything, unlike some of our other partners. But that's my main point here tonight, is that for the United States to maintain its leadership position in human spaceflight, which I agree with Joan is critically important not only for the space program, but for the country as a whole, I think that's where we need to focus our efforts and get over the xenophobia and allow it to happen and take the lead position in making it happen. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Our next speaker is an individual who has also worked in the White House. He was Executive Secretary of the Space Council under President George H.W. Bush, and I think he has been actively involved in the space business since that time. So let me turn it over to you, Mark.
Thanks, George, and it's a real pleasure to be here with this distinguished group of people to talk about something that most of the people in the audience certainly care a great deal about. First off, I'm going to resist the temptation to respond to some of the things that have been said, even though I'm dearly and sorely tempted. Second, since I'm the last speaker before you can get at your questions and we can start hashing over what's said, I'll try to be brief. I will confess right up front that I am a combat veteran of definitive space policy. And I'm also a combat veteran of partisan politics. And despite the bad name it has, I kind of like partisan politics, and I think it has a very positive role to play in where we need to go. I took as George's charge for a definitive space policy as comprehensive. So my remarks will be really looking at the United States space policy not as a NASA policy or a civil space policy or a human spaceflight policy, but a United States space policy. And the first thing I'd like to do with that in mind is to do a quick review of what I think the current situation is. First, I think we have a weak national policy in that regard. And what I mean weak is not in muscularity. There certainly are some very muscular parts of current U.S. space policy, but it has no strong center. It really has no overarching theme. It has no central plan. It's really largely a guidance document rather than a definitive plan with implementation, direction, and processes. Each department and agency is told what the government would like them to do and expects them to do, and lays it out by way of a strategic guidance, but it doesn't have any central theme or core. The independent national security and civil space programs are left really pretty much to implement their policy, that policy on their own. OMB is the integrator, if at all. There have been attempts over times to change that, but today, current situation is OMB is the integrator of this national space policy at all. And they do pretty much annual reviews at best. They do detailed reviews and adjudicate requests as they come in. But most of the resource cycle currently is dominated by congressional committees, which are very, very interested in the activities of the departments and agencies through hearings, through specific directions, through member interest. They're much more tightly coupled with the department and agencies as it relates to space than is the executive branch in the White House. That's just the way it is today. We have little or no international policy. There's good oratoric language in the policy about international cooperation is good and it should be supported and we should use our allies and partners to the maximum extent possible. But there's no centralized theme to it. There's no notion of national objective of international cooperation in things space. And it's a current vestige of the program we have. We have an uncoordinated, unfocused, yet growing commercial space infrastructure. To me, this is probably the most disappointing. You have department and agencies that are feeling their way, attempting to feel their way on how to integrate a growing commercial interest and commercial sector in space. And it's episodic. One department handles it one way, another department handles it another way, some with programs, some with permissive or non-permissive implementing rules and regulations. And so it's, again, it's something that's happening. It's big. It is potentially amenable to central policy management or organization and structure and guidance, but it is not currently done. So what's the results of current national space policy, in my opinion? Let's talk about DoD. We spend about $20 billion a year. And quite frankly, we're back to what most of us in this room would recognize is the Millstar era of very, very large, expensive satellite programs in DoD that are launched on very large and expensive launch vehicles rather infrequently. It's a vicious circle and a vicious cycle that we've been through before in the 90s, where you have ever bigger platforms because it is more and more expensive to launch them, and therefore the risks associated with any individual launch are so high, you try to make sure that the platform has everything on it. That, of course, justifies making launch costs more and more expensive because the payloads are bigger and more costly in and of themselves, and the risk of loss is higher and higher. Currently, DoD is scrambling, as everybody's talked about the budget austerity, which is certainly going to happen. I think it's going to be even more strong than people recognize. And DoD is scrambling with concepts like a disaggregation to adjust to the funding realities, i.e., let's make smaller platforms. Let's not put all of our eggs in one or two large baskets, expensive baskets. And we will achieve survivability or some military objectives through disaggregation. The problem is you're halfway through a cycle of large buys for large satellites, and multi-year procurement is the current administration's plan for trying to maintain costs. There's very little room, therefore, to start creating new disaggregated smaller programs. I won't spend a lot of time on NASA spending about $18 billion. We all know what's going on, and everybody's talked here about it. I would just simply say that the infrastructure of NASA is beginning to crumble, in my opinion. I think you see that at Kennedy and Johnson as flagships. I think to a lesser extent to smaller centers. You can begin, I'm sure you see it on a local level, but those are most obvious. The centrifugal organizational forces that drive duplication and cannibalism and diffusion of effort are really at an accelerating pace. Again, it comes back to the fact that the administration is not as focused on it, and the congressional committees are very focused on it. NOAA, $2 billion a year. I would say the weather program is in deep problems. NPOS was just sort of the tipping function, but there are innumerable problems with the weather program. And the commercial business for space in the United States, I would say it's a little less than $2 billion a year. We currently have less than 50% of the market share and less than 40% in launch. And with the MDA purchase of Space Systems Loral, that total market share, depending on whether you count Space Systems Loral as an American company or a Canadian company, could tip even further down. So what's the argument for creating a comprehensive national space policy, one that integrates all the parts of the United States space program? Well, the first one, the obvious one, is efficiency. Simply managing like activities as a whole, or at least in league with one another, can save money, unlock resources for other activities, cause collateral efficiencies by being forced to operate in close proximity, in some cases jointly. Obviously, low-hanging fruit like launch. The United States' current launch policy is, in my opinion, an embarrassment. We have at least 3 different launch programs, and all of them are becoming more and more expensive and becoming much more limited. Another reason is synergy. If you actually have the departments and agencies working collaboratively on national objectives, whatever that objective may be, you will get, in fact, new ideas, new technologies, new perspectives to problems that are not part of the parochial core. Today, things are done in stovepipes. NASA has its programs, DARPA has its programs, Air Force has its programs, NRO has its programs, and there's precious little synergy between those programs in terms of technology. Yes, there are a lot of conferences. Yes, there are a lot of meetings where ideas are exchanged, but it's really not collaborative research that I think could result in a much more aggressive program on all fronts. But really the largest reason and the most significant reason, and one we've seen in the past, is that it's part of a larger national strategy. But what one? The United States, as we've heard here, has had a policy largely out of the Cold War that said preeminence in space, leadership in space, was good for the United States in our efforts to win a war with the Soviet Union and alternative economic constructs. I am a veteran of trying to figure out how you can morph that strategy after the Cold War to create a positive role for United States leadership, being first, preeminence, dominating space militarily, being preeminent space explorers. But right now, we don't have a national strategy, I'll argue. Just as recently as last Sunday in the Washington Post, Anne-Marie Slaughter, who was part of the current administration's State Department, Princeton, head of the Woodrow Wilson School, suggested that the Obama administration consider 3 alternative new global strategies. I think it's remarkable that a person that senior in this administration's State Department would write an open op-ed saying we don't have a broad U.S. national strategy. And she suggested 3 that had been done by various think tanks. But I'll just read the titles to you to give you a flavor and ask yourself, how does the way we think about space, we being the space people, in terms of dominance, preeminence, leadership, fit into the context of U.S. national goals and strategy that would run under the banners of things like strategy for a post-exceptionalist era. These are literally the titles of them. And strategy for a post-Western world. And finally, a strategy for a sustainable planet. Again, she argued that these 3 studies, and they're comprehensive and they are coherent and comprehensive, alternative U.S. national strategies that she would argue even a week ago in the Washington Post are viable alternatives. I'm not going to talk about the merits of them, but we as space people have to think about how would an aggressive, comprehensive, definitive national space policy for the United States fit under the banner of those kinds of U.S. national strategies. I think it's something to think about because, to my mind, none of them fit in very well. Again, I agree with all the other participants. I think we have the space program today that's a result of all the forces on it. It's like physics. It is a result of the forces that have been applied on it. The only way, in my opinion, that you could change that is to have an overriding national policy for the United States for which a different kind of space policy would fit in, as it had in the past with the Cold War strategy. So I have a variety of suggestions of what we'd want to do if we ever came to that point, but I would be very interested in hearing others' comments about that, because I think the United States space policy for the last 50 years has really been driven as component of a larger U.S. national strategy. And I think one of the reasons we are where we are today with a program as diffused as it is because it no longer fits with a broad U.S. national strategy. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, George.
Well, thank you, Mark. If you have questions, if you'd pass them over to the people collecting them, and I'm going to give each of the panelists an opportunity, starting with John, to comment on the other comments that have been made by the other panelists. John?
Several of my colleagues have talked about the term consensus. And I wonder whether the seeking of a consensus on what we should do in space is really, first of all, achievable, and second of all, necessary. I mean, again, I bring the history to it. Second NASA Administrator, James Webb, didn't want to take on the Apollo assignment unless there was a consensus that it was the right thing to do. What did he mean by consensus? He meant agreement among the political leadership and particularly the congressional leadership that the program would be sustained and would be supported. He didn't care about a public opinion or broad elite opinion, maybe elite opinion, but certainly not broad public opinion. And he resisted putting forth any post-Apollo program because of the lack of that political consensus. And I think that's the operational definition of consensus that is relevant to today's discussion, not some broad sweep of public opinion. I guess the idea of if they only understood the value of space, they being the unwashed public, they'd support the program, is a non-starter in my way of thinking. And this comes from all the years I've spent inside the Beltway, that it is a consensus among the politically relevant people in this country that space should be part of our strategic portfolio that I think is missing. And I think those of us in the community have to do some introspection of why it is missing.
Eugene?
I'm kind of at a loss for words, and I don't mean that in any kind of critical way. It has been unclear to me for many years that we have the capacity to render space an element of national, international policy. And I speak in that as someone who participated in many activities a long time ago, early in my career, in a sense, attempting to help render the NASA program sort of an element of national, domestic and foreign policy in the way it was during the 1960s, as it was articulated by President Kennedy. I think that has eluded us. In a sense, I think that the drive to crystallize a single or coherent national policy towards space that I think has been reflected in some of the some of the comments this evening, that is not achievable and may not even be productive. There are, we live in a society, we're part of a country and in a world that has diverse needs, diverse imperatives, diverse motivations. And I would frankly be satisfied, again, having spent too many mental cycles many, many years ago, I think, thinking about a coherent national space policy. I would be happy with coherent parts of a space policy. I think that if we could achieve, frankly, if we could get one coherent part, that would be a big step forward, in my view.
Neal?
You were not at a loss for words, turns out. And I appreciate what you had to say. I think, I talked a little bit about the public issue and an uninformed public and an unengaged public and so forth. I still a little bit idealistic about our democracy, that somehow when we can, we owe it to as many people as possible to let them know what's actually going on and give them a chance to say something about it. But the realities are that there are key communities and segments that are going to help change our space policy in a more positive direction. As John has said, I guess I would argue that that community be larger than maybe it has traditionally been, and then we can have a conversation about what I mean, larger in which dimension and in which direction. But politics in the end is going to decide this, and pressures are going to have to come from people whose interests are served by a change in policy. Other thing I would say, maybe I would ask Mark, or suggest that depending on what our objectives are in space, maybe the word dominance would apply in some areas, and maybe cooperation or collaboration would apply better in others. And sorting that out, I understand, is not easy, but we've been doing that with other countries and other domains for a very long time, and companies do that. They cooperate when it's in their best interest, and they compete like crazy when it isn't. So it seems to me that is sorted out, but maybe in the public's understanding of this, it could be quite confusing as to whether the U.S. is going to go it alone, or U.S. is going to be dominant, or it's going to be preeminent in everything it does in space. Then people start to wonder why you're actually cooperating on the space station and other places. So somehow sorting that out in our discussion with the public, I think, would be an important thing to do.
Well, I'd just like to make a little comment. There's a lesson, I think, to be learned from evolution of biological organisms, and that is that you cooperate to be dominant. There's a tool for dominance.
Right. Yep. Good. A lot of people don't believe in evolution.
And we are in Texas.
Fortunately, none of them are here.
Sorry.
Joan.
I guess I'm going to start by picking up on Mark's reference to Anne Marie Slaughter's op-ed as well. Anne Marie Slaughter is a well-known liberal internationalist. And as a political scientist, I teach political theory, and when I teach the difference between liberal internationalists and realists to undergraduates, I say, how many of you watch Game of Thrones? Everybody. That's realist politics. I win, you lose. Today I'm your friend, tomorrow I'm your enemy, I'll stab anybody in the back. Space politics, Cold War politics, unfortunately, has been very realist. It's been modeled on words like dominance. One of the books I wrote talked about America's quest to dominate space. And I think there has now been recognition that it is technically impossible to dominate space, that it just doesn't work. And therefore, Anne Marie Slaughter, I would argue, as a liberal internationalist, and the image I use for that is the Federation of Planets. Everybody gets along, but sometimes you cooperate, and sometimes you compete. There's even a word which I really don't like, but it does serve a purpose, coopetition. where you sometimes work together and sometimes you compete. So I think what she's arguing is that there needs to be a recognition that continuing, for example, to just ignore China is not going to be in our best interest. Just to pretend that if we just ignore what they're doing, it doesn't matter to us, that will not serve the United States well. And I didn't mean to imply that the Chinese were not advanced. They are coming very quickly up the learning curve. What I was trying to point out was, contrary to those who are screaming, this is our crisis, China is our crisis, they have not invented unobtainium and left us behind, and are going to be doing warp drive off somewhere. There was an opportunity to work with them. And it is an opportunity which I think we need to take advantage of. Now, I will also tell you, I get hate mail when I say that. It is unpatriotic. And my argument to that is, if you think China is a competitor, then keep them close so you know what they're doing. If you don't think they're a competitor, then keep them close and let them pay the bills. Either way, I don't see the downside of this. And I guess the last point I would make is one of the words that I think needs to come out for discussion is when we're talking about comprehensive, which I do agree, we need to be talking comprehensive. I was trying to point that out when I talked about the multiple space communities. There needs to be accountability. Somebody needs to be in charge. You need to be able to turn around and say, why isn't this happening? Because right now, there are 100 people who can point their fingers at 100 other people and say, it's not my fault, it's their fault. So I think that needs to come into the discussion as well.
Very good, Joan. Leroy.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of folks tonight talk about, or several folks talk about space policy and the need for space policy to fit into the broader policies of the United States, and I agree with that. However, I smile because when I was a pretty new astronaut here, I was pretty young back then and fairly naive, and to me, space was pure. We were in this pure endeavor. It was goodness. We were doing this because it was just good. And how dare the president or the Congress use the space program as a foreign policy tool? And I remember in the early 90s when we started getting involved with the Russians, and I grew up during the Cold War, and so I was pretty well brainwashed at that time. And I was thinking, why are we doing this? And it became clear, well, because we need to find a mechanism to give them money to pay their scientists so they don't go work for countries like Iran and things like that. And I thought that was just a pollution of this pure space idea. But of course, I was wrong, and it does need to fit into the broader policies of the United States. I agree with space to the general public. I know the general public supports space, but they are arguably not as excited about space as they were during the Apollo days for many reasons, one of which is because space kind of became routine. We kind of were launching several times a year and going to a space station or going into orbit for a few weeks and coming back down, and people kind of got used to that. But I agree that we need to use the policy implications in the broader picture to drive support for the space program, especially within the government. If they see that the space policy can help them with foreign policy or other policies, then that becomes the driver of why they should support a robust space policy. And just one example I'll use, since we're talking a lot about China, and it's something I feel have pretty strong opinions on. The 2007 anti-satellite weapon test the Chinese conducted to worldwide condemnation, deserved, by the way, that they should have been condemned for that. But stop and think for a moment. If we had engaged them as partners in a civil space program as part of our civil space policy, made them perhaps a member of the International Space Station, would they really have gone ahead and conducted that test? Now, that's an interesting thing to think about. They certainly would have thought twice or three times about it. But once you're kind of in the same house as everyone else and you start caring more what those people think about you instead of always hearing that, these people are your enemies, so who cares? Let's go ahead and show them that we're powerful too. So I became a big believer in international cooperation for the reason that I think it's for the better good of the planet, of the United States, and of the U.S. space policy and overall policies.
Thank you. Mark?
Well, thanks. I'd like to pick up on the thread of cooperation, which I think is everybody's interested in, and I have a slightly different take on it. First off, I don't mean to suggest that the United States always should go alone, or in fact that has been the policy. It's useful to cooperate for a variety of reasons. But I think if you think about the future, and particularly the idea of China, which I think is an important one and one we ought to talk about, you have to put it in context of the main cooperation the United States has had in space over time, which has been with the Soviet Union and then Russia. We had a very specific policy objective in doing that. We didn't need their help when we started with Apollo-Soyuz and all of that. We did it because we were engaged with a conflict with the Soviet Union. And the conflict was not only material and military, but it also was for the hearts and minds or opinions of other countries around the world. The Soviet Union, as we now know, was very much feeling that they had a prestige problem. And they solved their prestige problem doing what they did best, which was build ballistic missiles, lots of them, and lots of nuclear weapons, because that was a prestige item that they believed that they could use to influence third countries around the world. The United States had a strategic objective that said we'd like them to stop building as many rockets, ICBMs, and nuclear weapons. And our space cooperation was implicit offer to them to give them prestige internationally without doing the thing that we found most destabilizing, which is building more missiles and more weapons. It was a strategic objective on the part of the United States. We didn't need their technical cooperation. We did it because we felt that we could offer them something that was in our national interest. The problem with China is, I think, the reason why we're stumbling so hard on whether we should involve the Chinese in international space endeavors is because we don't know what the strategic objective of the United States is to do so. I don't know what that is. Are they a competitor? Are they an adversary? Are they a partner? Well, they're all of those things. And the question is, until we sort out, in my personal opinion, until we sort out what is our strategic objectives with regard to China, and I think we're just beginning to sort those out, then and only then can we say, how does space cooperation fit into that context of what our larger strategic objectives are with China? And until we get to that point, I think we're going to have the problem of people who see that relationship in different ways and see the potential of cooperation, or in fact of cooperation, as either threatening or supportive to that view about the relationship.
Thank you. We do have some questions. There's one that perhaps, Leroy, you might be able to address. Raises the issues that would cause a problem relative to human exploration in space, galactic cosmic rays, radiation versus shielding, bone loss, and the effects of long-duration spaceflight.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks, George. You know, a lot of people think about what would it take to get to Mars? What would it take to get astronauts to a long-duration base over on the moon or something like that? And they think about technology. They think about propulsion and navigation and all that. But really, by far, the biggest long pole, and most people don't think about this, the biggest long pole technically is how do you keep astronauts healthy in space for long durations, especially away from the Van Allen belts where the radiation environment is much more harsh. That's why it's critical that we have a space station. People think, well, the space station's kind of boring. All it does is go around the Earth. It's not going anywhere. But guess what? It's on the space station that we're going to do the research to develop countermeasures to enable us to keep people healthy while we send them farther and longer into space. So all those issues, those biomedical issues, that is the one key area that we have to solve before we can talk about going to Mars or even an asteroid.
Thank you. Another question, Gene, that talks about sooner or later we'll have a habitable planet out there, and why shouldn't we look at developing a technology that would allow us to get there?
I think that it's fair to say that there is no technology on the horizon that is going to get us those distances in any kind of feasible timescale or with any robust reliability. It's one of the things that I try to convey to my students when I teach courses appropriate to this subject or pertinent to this subject is just what the distance scales are. I think that it would be nice to be able to send a device even to the nearest star, which is 4.5 light years away. But the planets that are being discovered are at very, very great distances. And I'm a technological optimist, but I'm not optimistic about that.
Thank you. And here's a question, Joan, that maybe you can address. With the rise in nationalism between China and Japan, could a potential conflict increase America's spending on space and a new Cold War?
That's been tried, and it has not been successful. Again, using China as the threat, we must do this, the perception. I don't think so. It's just, it's not the crisis. But I would go to Mark's point about, well, until we figure out, is China a partner or competitor? Again, I don't think it's going to come down to one or the other. And I think the danger of not working with China is that everybody else is. We can't be the leader if everybody else is in a group that we're not in. And I'm afraid that we're going to be standing there with our football, and everybody else is going to be playing a different game. So I don't think that waiting for a decision of we are friends, we are not friends. I don't think that's going to happen. So. If I could make one other point about public support, I have to add, I was pretty down on public support, and I agree with John that we need to convince the political elites. But I will say, several times I've taught a course called Space and Security, and this is to political scientists, who of course are in political science because they can't do math. So let's just be clear about that. So this is to political scientists to teach space and security, and what I talk about, talk about things like what's the difference between a rocket and a missile, what would happen if we didn't have GPS, what happens when a wrong signal is sent and cell phones go down, and oh my gosh, I can't use my ATM card. And inevitably, at the end of the course, on the course evaluations, it says everyone should be made to take this course. This is so important. People don't know this. This must be known. And the other question I ask them, because you can add on little questions, is, are we spending the right amount on space, or should we spend more or less? Right amount. So, they think it's very important, but no, the budget's fine the way it is.
I actually can't resist a comment on that. Years ago, during whatever budget battles were going on at that time, I used to make a practice when flying on airplanes, both when I was upgraded and when I was in the back cabin, of asking people sitting next to me which they thought was the larger budget, the Defense Department or NASA. And the most common response that I got was, I think they're about the same. And I thought it was remarkable, and I actually think it was just a sense that the space program, the NASA program, occupied such a kind of conceptual place in the society and had enough cross-section in the attention of people that they just assumed it was a really big budget item. And virtually every, and I was taught that, and the reason I make this remark about having asked this question both when I was upgraded and when I was back in the cabin. Upgraded, I tended to be sitting next to senior executives and corporations more likely, and the reactions were the same all the time.
But my point is, in a class, when you tell them, this is the budget, this is what's being done, and do you want to do more? Yeah, we really do. Do you want to spend more? No.
Let me try to piggyback a little bit on this, ask others here what they think. Let's say that President Obama had accepted the implicit recommendation of the Augustine Committee. I know you weren't supposed to make recommendations, but you suggested to have a good program, an extra $3 billion a year would be nice. I would hypothesize that President Obama could have increased the NASA budget by $3 billion a year without any political opposition, should he have chosen to do so. Does everybody up here agree?
No. Been there, done that, got the T-shirt.
And the scars?
Yeah.
Well, but Mark, I mean, the last Bush year, Bush 41 year, you put forward a 10% increase in the NASA budget, and it got through Congress.
John, it's so politicized. I mean, there's so many assumptions that would have to be embedded in how was it done, what was it about. But just to say, well, the program's $3 billion light. I've decided to ante up another $3 billion. Let's just steady as she goes. There'd have to be another song that go with that, in my mind, to get the Congress to say, oh, okay, we're $3 billion light, sure. We're in for another $3 billion. I don't think so. I mean, there'd have to be something else. That's my opinion. So I disagree with that.
But it also would have to be in the context of, I mean, part of the problem with the budget is the stability issue. And so getting a one chunk and then getting it taken away in a couple of years is a disaster waiting to happen.
Right. But we did manage, more or less in your time, Neal, to double the NIH budget.
Well, that was one member of Congress taking it as his highest priority, and had he had NASA in his budget, I think he would have done the same thing. That was John Porter. I've talked to him about it, Republican leader in Congress, and he just thought it was worth a lot more money because of the importance to the nation, and he felt the same way about science and technology, and so he pushed it. But then after the doubling, of course, it's been flat or down ever since, and biomedical research is in a crisis in the country. It's a lot of money, but they're in a crisis.
Here's another one for you,
Let me
Mark.
just make a quick comment. I would also argue that given the aspirations on the ambitious side of the aspirations that have been articulated, $3 billion would be a drop in the bucket compared to what that real cost would be. And we would be in the same situation, having the same argument about the future of NASA today if
If it were $3 billion
if it were $3 billion up.
Yeah.
Mark, how does Mars One claim that they can colonize Mars starting in the next decade affect NASA's manned space exploration policy?
Mars One? I don't know what Mars One is. How does Mars One claim they can colonize Mars starting the next decade affect NASA's? Well,
Doesn't.
it does. Yeah.
I've never
Mars
heard of
One
them.
is a group of zealots.
Okay. Well, hey, I've dealt with that as well. I mean, let me tell you, what goes
And
around
Mark,
comes around. I mean,
they have the T-shirt.
I tell you what, I must admit, I saw with great amusement the Bigelow announcement to send up an inflatable portion adjunct to the space station. And I remember very well the day, John does well, when there were people who were talking about a cheaper way to do space exploration, dramatically cheaper, exploiting inflatable technologies. And at the time, that was considered aggressive. And it is remarkable. I mean, good ideas do hang around. So maybe there's some very, very good ideas in there. I'm not aware of them.
Where is Lowell Wood?
He lives.
Well, here's one final question, and then some of you will have an opportunity to talk to the panelists after we break up. What can those of us here, the public, do to promote the need for a definitive U.S. space policy?
Well, I mean, a lot is the answer, but a lot of people in the room are very involved in K-12 education one way or another, and volunteering, and maybe we have teachers in the room, and I think it's pretty clear from what everybody has said that some of these challenges really are long-range challenges, and nobody is really expecting over the next year or two that we're going to reverse our priorities in terms of space versus other kinds of things. So I think just one of the things would be those in the room, probably everybody who's enthusiastic about space issues and studies space issues and knows the kind of things that, for example, Joan talked about, getting enthusiasm in the classrooms, and it goes home to the parents and the community groups that many people in the room are parts of, are often very excited about hearing They don't always have to have an astronaut, although if they can get one, that's clearly the top dollar. But they like to hear about everybody else in their views about things like science and technology in all areas, but also space. So I think just taking advantage of your relationships with young people and not so young people to make sure they understand what the situation is, things like how big the budget is, and what's come out of the space program and what opportunities really lie ahead that we've not been able to take advantage of. That would be at least one important thing everybody can do.
Any other comment?
I have one, but it's kind of a final comment, so if anybody else wants to go.
A closer,
A
okay.
closer, yeah. I mean, many of the people in this room work on a day-by-day basis in the space program. I realize not all of you do, but a goodly number do. And so you know that today was the day of remembrance of the crews that have lost in either the Apollo 1 fire or the 2 shuttle accidents and the others that have suffered fatalities related to space. Make sure to the best of your potential and ability that doesn't happen again. I mean, this is a demanding business, a challenging business, but all 3 of those accidents were management failures, not hardware failures. To the degree that I think is important, success has its rewards. And so continued success, I think, is a goal for all of you that have hands-on to the program, should strive every day for.
That's very true, John, and very real. Yes. Mark Albrecht is also the author of another book, Falling Back to Earth, the personal account of the Great Space Race and the end of the Cold War. So I would recommend that book to you as well. We have a number of authors up here on the stage. Appreciate you all coming this evening, and I hope you enjoyed the program. And maybe you'll have an opportunity to talk to the panelists here for a moment after we break up. So thank you all.
Really a pleasure.
John, it's a pleasure.
Really